Hello. Earlier today, we were exploring the issues of digital identity schemes and looking at success stories across the globe. It's now time to turn our attention to the UK, and we're going to be looking at developing a new trust framework for digital identity in the UK, the status, learning, and next steps. And I'm delighted to have a really expert panel for this discussion. So I'd like to introduce those people one by one. So first of all, we have Alison McDowell, who's the Digital Identity Advisor from the DCMS. Hi, Alison.
Hello, Andrew.
So if you could just give us a brief introduction to who you are and what you do, please.
Yeah, I'm an advisor to DCMS, and I lead a lot of our work on market development for digital identity. So DCMS has the remit to develop the legislation, governance, and policy for digital identity across the UK economy. And we're working closely with the market to make sure that we develop something that works for all of the sectors in the economy.
Thank you, Alison. I'd now like to introduce Nick Mothershaw from OIX. Hi, Nick.
Morning, Andrew. Afternoon.
Afternoon now, or at least in this part of the world.
Guess what? I'm only in Norfolk, so it's not too far away. So, so hi, I'm Nick Mothershaw, Chief Identity Strategist at the Open Identity Exchange. And the Open Identity Exchange is a members' organisation, not dissimilar to MEF actually, but focused on the identity industry. So our members are generally on the supply side or other stakeholders, and we look at digital identity. And our vision really is that all of us will have a digital identity of our choice that we can use to prove who we are anywhere we go in the world. And that might be using biometrics in vein analysis, as we've just seen from Hitachi, but it could be using many different forms of authenticators to do so. Our angle really is that all of that needs a trust framework wrapped around it, which is really the legal and contract elements that will actually make all of this a success.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Steve Pannifer of Consult Hyperion.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me on the panel today. So I'm from Consult Hyperion. We're an independent consulting firm working in the areas of payments and identity. And we've been fortunate enough to be involved in a whole number of different identity initiatives around the world. We're doing a lot of work in Canada and Australia, and also in the UK, which is where we're headquartered as well.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to start the discussion at, I'd say, quite a basic level. And the first question I'm going to ask is, what is a trust framework and why do we need one? So perhaps, Nick, if you'd like to pick up that point first.
Absolutely, yes. So a trust framework is the rules that sit around the use of an identity system. So we have lots of tools, that's the technology. So an authenticator like the vein thing analysis we've just seen is a tool as part of the overall identity solution. The trust framework is the rules, and that's legal rules, policies, procedures, standards, the way the technology connects in a legal basis. So that might be things like digital certificates that mean that a user that presenting themselves to a service provider online can be trusted to be the user who they're claiming to be, and also that they can trust the service provider is genuine. So it generally manifests in some form of trust mark, so that you know that the trust framework is in play. And an example there is things that we see in the payments area, like MasterCard, Visa, are trust marks, and they're evidence that scheme is in operation, and users understand to some extent what that scheme is. So if you spoke to a consumer, most consumers wouldn't really know the detail behind those schemes, but they know they can trust them. And over the years, they've built up a massive brand around trust. So the trust mark is the kind of public manifestation. Behind that are a whole set of rules. And ultimately, the rules say who should be doing what and what happens when something goes wrong. So one of the big things we get asked about trust frameworks is liability. Who if an identity is stolen or gets broken, data breach, who's responsible? And a lot of that is now in common law, but it all needs putting together in a package that means those who are relying on identities and those that are providing identities and those that are the users of identities all have a legal framework within which all of that operates with confidence for all parties.
Thank you, Nick. Alison, Steve, have you got anything you'd like to add to a very robust reply?
You go, Alison. You go first.
No, Stephen, I was going to say, I think Nick did a wonderful job explaining it, so I'll defer to you. It's fine.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's the useful acronym, the BLT, Business Legal Technical, which is a good way of kind of encapsulating the potential scope of a trust framework. And Nick's covered obviously all those things. And you need all that for a trusted identity scheme or ecosystem to exist, and for the participants to know that they're working in a trusted environment. They need to have answers to in all three of those areas: business, legal, and technical.
Thank you, Steve. No, the focus of this session is in the UK, but I know people on the panel have worked on other trust frameworks. So I'm going to stay with Steve, and please give us the benefit of your insight into some of the trust frameworks you've worked on in Australia and Canada, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I mentioned the BLT thing was kind of deliberate, because when you look at the frameworks that exist in other places, firstly, they don't all cover, they don't give comprehensive coverage of all of those things. Some of them are focused in one area or another. So, for example, in Canada, they've been working for a few years now on a thing called the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, and really what that is a set of standards. So there's assurance standards, meaning what are the processes you go through to ensure that the identity processes you're doing are robust. And really, that's kind of the primary focus of them. And they built certification around that. They've got a trust mark around that. But they don't, for example, step into the shape of the ecosystem. They don't step into legal matters. They talk about privacy, but in that they often defer off to the privacy legislation in Canada. And so they kind of gone. They kind of filled part of that BLT stack, if you will, expecting that when commercial propositions are brought to market, that those schemes will fill in the rest. Australia's a little different in the sense that there's actually two schemes in play there, but there's one that's probably most important. The government there has published a thing called the TDIF, Trusted Digital Identity Framework, and its primary focus was around how to get digital identity services that meet the needs of government to enable government digital services to work. But what they've done last year is they've actually opened up the certification program a little bit to say, well, actually, this could be good in the private sector. So we're starting to see some change there. How far that goes, we'll have to see. I guess, and then coming back to the UK, I mean, what the UK's attempting to do is actually quite bold. We're in the trust framework that DCMS is putting out. It's addressing all three of those. And one of the things we're involved in, I'm sure we'll talk about now, is how far we can go in all three of those areas, and how do we make sure that we bring the whole community along in that process.
Thank you, Steve. That's an excellent introduction to my next question. You've lined it up beautifully. And I was going to ask, what is the current state of play of the UK Digital Identity Trust Framework? And I think that question to Alison, please.
Thanks, Andrew. It's interesting because we did a call for evidence last year, and we responded in September. And people don't write. We had 140 responses, which is huge for a call for evidence. And people don't write in asking for a trust framework, but they do say we need some sort of rules to show us what good digital identities look like, right? So, and our answer to that was a trust framework. But I think it's something that we use quite freely in a digital identity space. But what it really means to the people who are using it is that they can understand that the reusable things that people are showing them are good, and that they can rely on them or trust them. So what we did is we published a set of standards and rules and a certification process, an intention to publish a certification process in February, and we published it as an alpha. I think it's important that what we did in two reasons. The first was it covers both digital identity and attribute. So it can cover your identity as well as personal data that shows that you're eligible for something. So I'm eligible to buy wine because I can prove I'm over 18, but you don't need to know my actual date of birth or my address or my driver's license. And the second thing that I think was important is that the UK published it as an alpha. It was knowingly incomplete. We didn't have certification or liability in there, and that was so that we could work more closely with private sector and other key stakeholders like civil society to get it right. So since February, we've been doing two things. On the trust framework side of things, we've been engaging with loads of stakeholders so that we can publish a complete version, which will still be something that we'll iterate over time this summer. Simultaneously, we've been working on a governance body or a governance structure that will oversee the trust framework and keep it up to date and allocate trust marks, as Nick was talking about. And then we've been working on codifying all of these things into legislation so that they have the legislative standing that they need. And I guess the next thing that will happen, as I said, is that the trust framework will come out this summer. And then we'll also be consulting on the governance and legislative proposals later this summer as well. So that's where things stand in the UK.
A lot of work going on. I wonder if Nick's got anything to add to what Alison has just said.
Oh, you're right. There's a huge amount of work going on, and it's brilliant to see the government taking such a cooperative approach to working with the private sector. So since February, and we reviewed the alpha, provided feedback on that as OAX, as I'm sure many other organisations did. I know you had over 1,000 responses on that. But we're now working closely on some of these policy questions around things like liability, the certification approach, data portability, and each month we're working with the team at DCMS through a set of questions, providing our feedback as a members organisation to that to help continue to input into the trust framework so that it works well, not just for government but for private sector as well. One of its main target markets, if you like, is to enable and create a thriving market for digital identity in the private sector for private sector use cases. But many trust frameworks either are for or start with government. This one's been written to be equally applicable to government and private sector at the same time. So I think, to Steve's point, this is quite innovative. In Australia, they're taking the public sector government version and starting to make it applicable to the private sector. In the EU, there's the EIDAS framework, and they're looking at that in the same way, taking that into private sector use cases now. They've done that partly for AML, but they're looking to do that now further in a broader sense. So the UK doing this simultaneously in a public-private approach in terms of the target, but also with a public-private approach in terms of its creation is really brilliant, and it's very exciting for the industry to be part of at the moment. And we're preparing May's feedback at the moment for the government to go into the next iteration. But we're looking forward to seeing in summer. And then at OAX, we've got members lining up to adopt and get certified. And then another thing we could perhaps talk about is schemes, looking at particular sectors that are starting to emerge.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to come in there before I move on to the sort of next bit of my question?
Well, I might take you there. So, I think everything that Alison has explained about the current status of Nick said, that's all very helpful. I was just reflecting on the fact that this is not an easy thing to do. It's a complex problem to address, and there are many stakeholders with differing viewpoints, and I'm sure Alison gets the raw end of this the whole time. But it's a bit like, I'm sure it's a bit like herding cats, in the sense that everyone's going off in different directions. There are a lot of vested interests. Obviously, commercial players, they want to see a framework that helps promote their own particular, business proposition. So that's a challenge. I think that another big difference between maybe the UK and Canada is in Canada, the writing was kind of done by the community. It was done jointly with some public sector people and some private sector people. In fact, I wrote part of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework as well. Whereas what we've got here is the government holds the pen, and then they're out talking to people, collecting views and opinions, and then trying to reflect that back to them, which is an approach. And I'm not saying that's a bad approach, but obviously it's kind of different, and so that means the dynamic of the progress is perhaps a little bit different. And I think the other big question is we don't really know what the digital identity ecosystem will look like. The whole point of this is to put the conditions in place to enable an identity ecosystem and the industry to evolve, but it could go in a number of different directions. And because we don't know what direction it's going to go in, it's actually perhaps a little bit more challenging to write something that kind of is perhaps most relevant, because you end up. I mean, Nick's got this brilliant diagram where he kind of lays out all possible permutations, and it's like, yeah, great. If it ends up looking like this, we're stuffed because it's so complicated. Yeah. But the point is, it won't end up looking like that. It'll end up looking like some subset of that. We don't know what the subset is at the moment. So I think that's quite a challenge, I think.
Oh, no, complex stuff. I mean, one of the questions that springs probably to the uneducated mind is, they've got these digital identity schemes in other countries. Why can't you just take one of those and apply it? What are the main reasons why we can't just take the model from another country and apply it? I'll go to Alison on that one first.
It's something we get asked quite often, and it'd be lovely if we could, obviously, but there are a number of things about the UK that is unique. So for instance, we don't have a national identity card, and not only that, it's illegal for us to have one. So we can't do what Estonia has done and simply digitize our national ID card. We've said that our system must be inclusive. So we have to have something that isn't simply led by one sector. So a lot of the Nordics started out in banks and then included everyone afterwards. And we're trying to create something that includes everyone from the start. So that makes it different. We think that privacy is incredibly important in the UK. And so our system can't be copied from China, for instance. We think that security is incredibly important. So we've said we won't have a central honeypot of data. And so we can't copy India's approach. And we've said that whatever we do has to be internationally interoperable. And so similarly, while often people would look to the US if they're trying to create a market-based solution, we can't simply pick up things that the US has done in the past because they haven't focused as much on international interoperability. So we find ourselves in a position where we're able to borrow a lot from a lot of these systems, and we're able to learn a lot from work that we've done with Europe, work that we've done through gov.uk Verify, work that we've done with other Commonwealth markets like Canada and Australia. But unfortunately, in the end, we do have to create something bespoke for the UK values and the UK context in which this will sit.
Yeah, no, I think the context and cultural issues are very important. And certainly when we had sessions earlier, in Singapore, for example, a very centralized system. You get your ID at 15 and it stays with you for life. That's, as you say, just not the case in the UK.
No.
Steve, Nick, you got any views on why we can't just take an off-the-shelf solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps just to extend what Alison has said, when you look around, I mean, just look around Europe, and Nick mentioned EIDAS, but actually what EIDAS does is it puts in place a mechanism for mutual recognition of different identity schemes. And within the countries in Europe, there are different, in some cases, multiple schemes, but there are different identity schemes. And they exist for the different cultural, geographic, whatever reasons, the sorts of things that Alison was mentioning. The one other thing I would add is that ultimately what's an identity scheme doing, or what's a framework doing? It's there to enable access to services where identity is important, and often the rules around those services are governed by regulations. So the obvious example being financial services, where you have anti-money laundering regulations, and those regulations are defined at the country level as well. So kind of everything kind of for the moment operates at country level. There is international work, there's international standards around technology and other things. So as Alison said, we should be able to borrow stuff. It's not we don't have to start from a complete blank sheet of paper. There's a lot to build on from, but we have to make it contextually relevant to the UK.
Yeah. Nick?
Yeah, and I think I would add to that the values Alison referred to as being UK values, I think, are increasingly becoming global values, particularly in this particular area. So I'm not saying that UK values generally apply globally, but the approach to privacy and the approach to user ownership of data is a global movement. So technically, we have the movement of self-sovereign identity, which is where the user owns their own identity, can manage it themselves, can choose to move it if they wish. So portability is built in there. Data minimization is built into that principle. They only share the minimum amount of data, their data, with another party in order to undertake the business transaction that they are creating. And that technically has got some new ways of delivering things in terms of I think it would dig common verifiable credentials, which uses certificates but uses them in a traceable way. That enables us now to move to that user centricity. And this is very much a global movement. So what the UK is doing is kind of writing the most modern trust framework in the world that will embrace that new user-centric approach on one hand, but also create a free market for identity. In a lot of other places, it's been government-led and almost government-controlled. And we do see a big difference in identity solutions depending on the nature of laws in countries. So in the UK and other Commonwealth-style countries, where our law is very much based on common law, we've got a much more privacy-centric approach to identity. In other countries where it's much more legislative-based civil law, then often a government-led centralised approach has been done or is being done, and at the moment feels appropriate. But I think this privacy movement, if you look at what Tim Berners-Lee is doing with the Solid initiative, where the user owns their data on the internet and shares it by permission with agents, if you like, who are going to make assessments and give them the data back, is going to be the way the internet itself moves. It's the way the globe's going to move, and identity is at the absolute heart of that movement.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Nick, of who actually owns the data. Is it the individual or is it the organization that holds the data? And I don't know if we've got a kind of UK working assumption on what that's likely to be. And, you drew the distinction between some countries where it's mandated and others where it's voluntary.
Yeah, I think in the UK, I think it will be, if you look at the emerging identity providers, a lot of them are of the self-sovereign flavour, if you like, and that implies very clear user ownership. But in any identity implementation, the user owns their data as part of the privacy policy. And this is part of the framework. There will be a privacy policy, a set of terms and conditions that would say, well, this is your identity. If you wish to close it and move it somewhere else, you can do that. And that's certainly the trust frameworks that OAX recommend, and what's got to be in the trust framework. The users, very much owned by the user. Whether it's physically owned by the user or logically owned by the user is a technical implementation difference. But I think this principle of user ownership runs through everything that the UK team are doing. Certainly,
this is of course a kind of a big change in the way that businesses in the economy generally think about their customers and their customers' data. And I think there will need to be a lot of education for organisations that perhaps are outside of this kind of industry, this community, to understand that putting customers in control of their data actually ends up you end up in a better place economically. So customers are more trusting. You're then not competing on things that are inefficient. And so it ends up being better for everyone. But of course, a lot of businesses currently, they see the identity data that they hold as being want something of great value to them, but they don't want to easily give up, and they don't want their relationship with the customer to be disintermediated. And so there is a learning curve that we need to take people through. We're not trying to disrupt the business relationship. What we're trying to do is put it on a better footing, a more efficient footing, really.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We've sort of talked about where we've been and where we are now. I'd just like to look a little bit more at the process moving forward. And I'm an impatient individual, so I'm wondering, when will we see a live digital identity system working in the UK? But I'm also a realist and know that you've got some tremendous hurdles to go over before that system could go live. So maybe go first to Alison. You talked about some of the short-term steps, but what's the kind of bigger picture in terms of where it's heading?
Yeah, I mean, if I speak on behalf of government, our plans are that we will release the Trust Framework Alpha and the consultation. The Trust Framework, the second iteration of the Trust Framework Alpha coming out this summer, allows us to start to kick off testing. I imagine we will start with testing the certification process, because that's something that's relatively straightforward for us to do without the legislation in place. But we'll be talking to people in the next month about our plans to make sure that they make sense for industry. The consultation kicks off the legislative process. Our hope is that we'll be in the third session. Exactly what the parliamentary timetable will be, that one's out of my hands. There's a lot of things going on in this country right now that'll be competing for airtime in the parliamentary timetable. But this is definitely a priority, and we'll get it in there quickly. Having said that, there are still things the market can do once the trust framework is complete. So they don't have to wait for certification and for a formal governing body to stand up. So, I think you could be seeing the beginnings of digital identity next year, certainly within 2. I don't know. Nick may have a different view. Steve may have a different view, but we're getting to a place where there's fewer and fewer barriers. I don't think we're going to all be using digital identity in a perfectly seamless way for all of our transactions in all sectors for another few years.
Thank you, Alison. Nick, Steve, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I can come in. So behind the trust framework that has been created by government are a number of schemes. Or in fact, you might say some of them are ahead of it, or certainly in parallel. And so what a scheme is within the trust framework is a sector-based initiative that is looking at how digital identity is used within a particular sector or use cases within that sector. And there are at least half a dozen of them already in play at various different stages within the UK. So we've got groups that they're often led by a trade body in a particular area who's seeing that digital identity could solve problems for its members in a particular sector, and is therefore working to make sure digital identity is adoptable and adopted in that sector. And those schemes are all working with the framework and in parallel so that they can adopt the framework as soon as practically possible. Now, the schemes are in different states of play. Some of them have been running longer than others, but there are schemes looking at finance in terms of allowing a user to onboard themselves for a new financial account instantly using a digital ID. Pensions, in terms of using pension dashboards to prove who they are, to enable users to access the pension data. Looking also at payments and the possible addition of digital ID alongside confirmation of payee as a secure way of understanding who the identity you're paying is. Then that's affirmed through a digital identity connection. Home buying and selling group are looking at property transactions, so that if you buy a property, or this could be, I guess, applied to renting as well, that rather than having to go through AML checks and KYC checks again and again and again, you do that once for the property buying process. Employment vetting, there's a scheme coming out of disclosure and barring service looking at how digital identity could be used there. And then age verification, both face-to-face in kind of retail environments for alcohol purchase, for instance, or online for age-sensitive services. So there are schemes looking at all of those different areas at the moment, all looking at digital identity to enable users to more easily access services safely in a trustworthy manner. So when will these hit? When will they actually be able to go live? I think by April next year, we'll have the first certified, hopefully, schemes in operation. And those schemes will be certifying digital identity providers and other actors in the system to provide certified identities. And then the market starts. So I think within a year, we've got this market kicking off. It'll then take a little while to get that market growing. There'll be some first adopters. I'm sure there'll be some teething problems as we go. But within, I'd say, 2 or 3 years, I think this market will be well underway. And I hope within 5 years, we will all use digital identities without a thought.
And I suspect that digital identity doesn't come in a single flavour. You sort of gave the example of age verification, which is a relatively simple thing in my uneducated view, versus a property transactional banking payee confirmation, which is at the more secure end and certainly the more complex end. So do those present different challenges, having to satisfy multiple use cases and multiple applications?
Who do you want to take that, Andrew?
I'm kind of whoever would like to jump in first.
I guess in the strictest sense, the standards in the trust framework give levels of confidence. So you might say, this is what you need to do to create a good ID to prove that you're over 18. But if you're going to prove that I should give you a £500,000 mortgage, you're going to have to try a little harder. And I need to be really sure that you are who you say you are. So there's different levels of confidence. Clearly, some of those easier transactions that Nick mentioned can be done with lower levels of confidence, right? It's just like risk in any scenario. So there are provisions in the trust framework to allow that to happen. I guess it'd be interesting to see what Nick or Steve think about, will the market develop faster for those lower level of confidence transactions, or do we think, we're going to be in getting mortgages with digital identity from the start? That'd probably be for them to opine on rather than government.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully we should see fairly soon, because with the, there's the home buying, selling pilot that or project that Nick's mentioned about is going on right now. It's the thing that you have with identity is there are kind of two kind of parallel things. You've got the onboarding part of it, and that tends to be quite difficult, and for some services quite expensive. And then you have the authentication part of it, which is where you're just like logging onto the service or accessing services on a regular basis. And onboarding is expensive but low frequency, and authentication is high frequency but low value. And so you have to make a bet. Are you going to go for volume and then hope that the value comes afterwards, or do you go for the high value ones but then risk that you don't have the volume? And that's kind of the problem that the industry needs to grapple with, the individual providers need to grapple with.
Changing tack a little bit, and it could be trying to be representative of the libertarian nature of the UK. We could argue, isn't this just an identity scheme in another guise, that you're actually giving us identity cards?
Well, it's not, but the problem will be, how do you communicate that? Because technically it's very. We haven't got time to explain how on the call, but technically it's perfectly reasonable to have. I can have my phone here with something that to me is one utility that I use to prove my identity everywhere else. But under the hood, each one of those interactions is unlinkable from each other interaction. So there is no kind of single identity where I get tracked across the economy, across the universe. So that's all perfectly feasible. The problem is, we want to give people the convenience that they have that one utility, that one app on their phone or something. And then how do you communicate to them that actually you've got one app on your phone that you're using to access all these things, but don't worry, you're not being tracked. That's really the problem.
Yeah, it does sound like one of the challenges, isn't it, in communication?
Yeah. I mean, go on, Alison. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think Steve explained it really well, and so it isn't the same as us taking all of your data and putting it in a central place and issuing you a plastic card from it. The data remains in its home location, and the magic happens, as Steve said, under the hood to pull it all together. It's also, I think, important to note that we in no way want digital identity to be mandatory in this country. There are no expectations that everyone carries it. We simply want to ensure that anyone who wants to be able to use digital identity is able to.
Yeah.
Which is a very different scenario from having mandatory digital identity cards issued by the government.
Yeah, and certainly a very different starting point in the UK to other international digital identity schemes that do have that mandated position at the outset.
Exactly.
I've had a question come in, which is interesting. So how different is digital identity in the UK now since Brexit, since we've left the European Union? Has it made your lives easier, more difficult, just the same?
I mean, as far as government is concerned, you won't be surprised to hear that our legislative aims are to ensure that digital identity is governed by UK data protection law rather than EU data protection law. That's really the only change thus far. So we're hoping that passes. And otherwise, I think we still have the same flexibility. I don't know if Steve and Nick are seeing other things.
I think it depends on the use cases and problems you're trying to solve. So the whole point of EIDAS was cross-border interoperability, and so if you're in the business of trading with organisations in Europe and you need to be able to sign documents or prove your identity as part of that, and I mean let's remember that EIDAS itself is still relatively early. I mean, it's not the adoption of it. You've still got some way to go in terms of adoption right across Europe. So instantaneously, probably to those businesses, not a lot of difference because you'll still have other, legacy ways that you do those things. But obviously, what we want to do is make sure that what we build has the ability to be interoperable into Europe, into Canada, wherever, so that we can get those digital transactions moving in the future. Yeah,
very, very definitely. Yeah. Nick, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so that point of interoperability is really key. So we've got the different schemes, as we talked about in the UK. We're working with OAX to try and encourage interoperability across sectors. What may happen, because choice is really important here as well, that as we see the progress of the market, that we end up with sort of clusters of identities, maybe for different purposes or groups of purposes. But the users will ultimately want to use a single identity for many different purposes because it's easiest to do so. But they have the choice of using different identities if they wish. So I think as we see the market emerge, we might see kind of clusters, back to Steve's point, of identities that are used for authentication and maybe simpler use cases around things like age, and others that are used for the more high trust areas, maybe others that use travel, which is a very specific use case with a lot of attributes that need to be added to enable you to get on a plane, for instance, particularly with overlaying COVID. And I know you've got a session on that later in terms of COVID certificates and where they fit in here. So I think it may be that on my phone in the first few years of this, I have several different identities that I'm using for different purposes. But we also, OAX's vision and many of its members' visions are interoperable identities, and we continue to promote that vision in our work with the schemes and with the trust framework. That's where we're trying to position, so that the users can have that single identity if they wish to use wherever they can. But that's still not a national identity. It's still an identity of the user's choice from a commercial provider with whom they can move that identity and their data at will. So I think in no way does that start to look like a national identity scheme. I don't think.
No, very, very much not. We do have a session on COVID health passes or health passes later on in the day. Some people have said that COVID has been an accelerator for digital identity. Is that the case in the UK as well?
I think that it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether it's accelerated it or not, because we were in the midst of writing it anyway. I think that what it's done is it has it's brought it to life a lot more clearly. It's a really easy use case to see that I have this test and I want you to bind it to me so I can go on holiday. So I think in some ways it's clarified for people the value of digital identity. The struggle with the whole COVID piece is a trust framework in and of itself. What does it mean to be vaccinated? Which vaccines count? Who injected you? In what lab were the tests carried out? All of those things. So that's probably done a lot for explaining what trust frameworks are as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would point to financial services. I mean, over the last year or so, people have still had to get access to financial services, and to do so requires you to demonstrate your identity. And so, actually, whilst we don't have the sort of fully matured identity kind of ecosystem in place, what we do have are some kind of, we're in a sort of transition period where we have things that allow you to take paper documents, but to present them in a digital context. So I can scan a passport and do a biometric selfie check. That's not where we want to head with digital identity. We want digital identity to be natively digital and for it to be portable. But at least those are the same types of technologies that we're starting to employ, and the use of those will have in financial services. I don't have the stats, but the use of those, I'm sure, will have grown in the last year. And certainly, if you look at where the sort of investment money is going, a lot of money is going into those kinds of organisations just now.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got another question that I'd like to explore with you, and that is, how do we ensure that a trust framework, a digital identity scheme, reaches all sections of society? We've sort of seen instances in other countries where people without bank accounts, for example, can't access these sorts of services. People without a smartphone can't access these services. So how do we ensure inclusion in these schemes? Again, whoever would like to give their brief thoughts on that topic.
You want to kick off, Nick?
I can do, yes. Yeah. So right now, OAX is doing a project on inclusion, and we've done some analysis of what we're terming the ID challenged, and that is enabling us to understand who in the UK, so it's a UK specific project, hasn't got a passport and a driving license. So we've done some socio-demographic modelling. We're about to release this new report for it to come out next month now, which will put a number on the ID challenge. So how many people we think are going to have a challenge just using passport or driving license to get into an identity ecosystem, and then how else can they get in? What other data sets may be made available? And that could be things like open banking. I think it will give a big boost there because lots of people already have a bank account, but they don't have a passport or a driving license. So leaning on that open banking as an identity proofing source will help address a big chunk of those people in the ID challenge population. And then other data sources, so things like council tax data, social security data from DWP, maybe data from HMRC that may be able to be released for identity proofing purposes that will bring more people into the ecosystem. But we also need ways to bring people into the ecosystem that are not just data-based. So in the latest version of the trust framework, we have the capability to include vouching as well, and we're exploring what does vouching look like in the future. So today, if you want a passport, you can get someone to essentially vouch you in. They sign the back of your photographs and say they know you. The same process is required for digital identity generally. Very similar process, but who can do that? How do they do that? And what are the rules for vouching? It's something that, again, we're exploring at the moment. But it's imperative that digital identity is inclusive, either inherently digitally or through people being helped into the system.
Thanks, Nick.
I guess I'd just add that in addition, we've done quite a bit of research in government looking at who will have a hard time getting a digital identity. And one of the key things will be that you're able to get a digital identity in a physical setting. So for instance, I could go into my local library, or I could go to the post office, and somebody could explain the process to me. We think that would be very important for a number of people who fall into these categories Nick was talking about, that they'll just need some help in getting a digital identity, but then once they have one, they'll be able to use it. So it's both what data sources you use and then the methodology that's used to actually give you the digital identity that covers inclusion.
Right. Well, sadly, we've run out of time. I did have quite a few other questions that I wanted to ask you this afternoon. That maybe we'll have to have a repeat session in a few months' time. But I'd like to thank Alison, Steve, and Nick for a fascinating insight into the UK Trust Framework, and best wishes in moving forward. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Bye.